Hello, my name is Amber O'Neill Johnston, also known as Heritage Mom. I blog on heritagemom.com, and you can find me on Instagram at @heritagemomblog. I'm really excited to be doing this video today. We're homeschoolers, and we're studying the 1700s in school this year. And as part of our Charlotte Mason style of education, we study famous artists during each term. We do a different artist each term, sometimes maybe a couple artists in this case. And in my research, I was trying to find some diverse artists, some Black African-American artists that I could study with my children this school year. And it was hard for this time period. So following a bunch of rabbit trails led me to an artist called named Prince Demah, but I could not find very much information about him at all. I couldn't even find enough to study or say much about him. And I came across an article, and the article was written by a woman named Paula Bagger. And I thought, who is this? And maybe, just maybe, I could get some more information on this artist from her. So that led us to this video today. I would love to introduce Paula Bagger. She's the president of the Hingham Historical Society, and that little nugget of information is what led me to her. And she has graciously agreed to speak with us today. Welcome, Paula.
Well, thank you for having me.
Great. I'd love if you could tell the kids just a little bit about yourself and kind of how you came to get into this type of work, maybe?
Sure. So, my day job is being a lawyer, but I studied history when I was in school, and I love history. And so I have for years volunteered with the Hingham Historical Society, which is an organization in the town that I live in, which is about 12, 15 miles south of Boston, Massachusetts. And so I do various things there, and I'm currently the president, which means I head the board of directors. But I'm a volunteer and I work there. But what led me to Prince Demah is that there are two paintings that have been on the wall of our museum for years and years and years and years, and they are paintings of a couple named Christian and Henry Barnes. And the Barneses were from the Revolutionary War era, and they were loyalists, which means that they didn't support the revolution. They were on the British side and wanted to stay part of Britain. And the paintings were left behind in America when the Barneses had to flee to England during the Revolutionary War. Things weren't always safe for people who didn't support the revolution, and they had to leave. Mrs. Barnes, whose picture you saw, she was a big letter writer. And I began reading all of her letters at different libraries, including the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and some other places to learn more about her. And at first I was focused on a Black woman named Daphne, who the Barneses had enslaved. And Daphne lived to be a very old woman, and she was a cook. But then I learned that Daphne had a son named Prince, who was a talented artist, and who Mrs. Barnes also wrote about all the time in all her letters to her friends. There were no telephones back then, so people would write like 3 or 4 letters a day. I mean, it's crazy. They were always just writing letters to people. And she was always talking about Prince in her letters. So I set off trying to learn more about Prince and whether he had painted these two pictures.
That sounds really, really interesting. I love that you were just curious and your curiosity led you to dig further. I think one thing we talk about in our home, like becoming lifelong learners, where it's not just things that are assigned that we're interested in or the minimum of what we have to do, but letting our curiosity drive us. So I love that. And now we're benefiting from that research that you did. So I'm going to share my screen and show, display some of the pictures. There are 3 pictures specifically that we're going to be studying this school year. So we'll be doing, for those parents at home, we'll be doing half a term of this artist, and then we'll talk about another one. So this is the picture of Mrs. Barnes that you just referred to, and Mr. Barnes, and I'll save the third picture until we get to that. So kids, do you have any questions? Who wants to go first?
Me.
Okay, go ahead, bud.
Who is Prince Demah and how did he find the first painting?
Well, Prince Demah was a Black man who lived in Boston from around 1741 to 1778. I say around because a lot of people, and often a lot of Black people and enslaved people, didn't know when they were born. He was born a slave and he died a free man. He was a skilled and largely self-taught artist who worked as a portrait painter in Boston for a very short period of time during the Revolutionary War. And the three paintings that you have studied, your mom just said, oh, there's only three paintings, and that's because they're the only ones we have found yet by Prince. But we know he painted a lot of other ones, and we hope they come to light. So you asked about finding the paintings. I actually knew about the Barnes paintings before I knew who Prince was. It kind of worked the other way around because they hang in a museum in Hingham, where I live. And it has been a very slow process to learn about Prince. It's difficult to find out details about anyone who lived very long ago, but it is much more difficult to find out about Black and Indigenous people who are less likely to be in a lot of the historical records. I was helped by the fact that Mrs. Barnes wrote all these letters all the time and talked about Prince all the time. And so that gave me a lot of clues where I might find information about him.
Great, thank you so much. So I think that when we were doing the research, those two pictures here and here, Mr. and Mrs. Barnes came out, but then another picture, Sasha, do you want to mute yourself since the neighbor's dog is picking up on yours?
Yeah.
Thanks, honey. There's a third picture that kept coming up, and it was this one.
Yes.
And then, you know what, Sasha, I told you wrong because I think you wanted to ask the next question, honey. You can unmute and ask your question and then mute again.
How did you contact the museum and how did they verify that Prince Demah painted the picture they had?
Yeah,
So
well,
I told her a little bit about the background of this picture. So that's what she was asking about.
And that was really part of Beckett's question, and I probably should have answered it. So there is one painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, which is about as different from the Hingham Historical Society in Hingham, Massachusetts as you can get. It is a huge museum with thousands of items. And I first heard that they had a painting, it's of a man named William DeGood, because I saw a website about an exhibit that they had at the museum. And the exhibit was about textiles. It was about clothing, interestingly enough. And the reason that they had bought that picture at an antique sale was because of the wonderful, it's called a banyan that the Mr. DeGood is wearing. It's kind of like a fancy bathrobe that rich men would wear at home back in the old days. And when you look at the picture, you'll see that he's wearing an absolutely spectacular one. It's all flowers embroidered on it and everything. And so they bought the picture and they put it in their exhibit. And it says on the back on a stretcher. And what a stretcher is that oil paintings are basically canvas that is placed on a frame of wood. The canvas is stretched on wood and they call them stretchers. And in one of the wooden stretchers, it says Prince Demah Barnes. And then it says Pinxit. And Pinxit is Latin, which means painted it. And so they had put that in the description of the painting. They knew the name and they knew about the painting, but they had no idea that he was an enslaved Black man from Boston. And so they were very excited to hear about it. How did I contact the museum? I just wrote a letter. Dear, to the name of the woman who was the curator of the exhibit, and just said, thought you might want to know. And I think she called me up maybe 2 minutes after she received her mail. She was very excited. And they offered to have their experts look at our paintings to make sure they were all by the same artist, because ours aren't signed. The two Barnes portraits don't have a signature. And so I put them in the back of my car and I drove to New York, which was a lot of fun. So how did they figure it out? A couple different ways. They had theirs they knew was signed, and then they looked at ours and they thought they looked the same. I don't know, but they also did a bunch of scientific tests on them and could tell that the canvas was all from the same bunch of canvas, and that the canvases were prepared the same way. And that's artists put a coat of something on their canvases before they paint their paintings. And that was all done exactly the same. So that made them pretty sure that the same person had made all three paintings.
Okay, that's really great.
So it was cool.
Yeah, it's very, very cool. Nina, do you have a question for Ms. Bagger?
Yes. Why does the picture of William de Gude look so different than the paintings of Mr. and Mrs. Barnes?
So I thought so too, and I think I just mentioned that. I thought they looked completely different when I looked at them. And the answer turns out to be different for the two Barnes portraits, but pretty interesting. The experts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art think that the painting of Mrs. Barnes is a copy that Prince made of a portrait that no longer exists by the very famous 18th century American painter, John Singleton Copley. They base that on the fact that it kind of looks like a painting by John Singleton Copley, but also they looked at the painting under a microscope or some kind of scientific instrument, and they could tell that Prince on this painting used little tiny brush strokes as opposed to big brush strokes like he did on his other paintings. And so what they said, have you ever tried to copy something? Like if your mom said, make an exact copy of something, you're going to really go slow and you're going to go like this because you're just trying to copy it perfectly. And they said, that's what this looks like, that he was trying to copy perfectly something else. Now, the portrait of Henry Barnes, unlike you and me, Nina, they think they look alike. And they said that they thought that the noses were made the same way. And they said that they thought that the way in which he painted the clothing looked very similar. And so they based their opinion not only on the fact that they think they look alike, but that what I said about all of the science. But I think that it's fair to say that Prince was able to paint in a couple of different styles. And it was probably, it might have been important to make the portrait of Henry look a little bit like the one of Christian. And so he might have channeled a little bit of that style of painting.
So if I understand you correctly, on this picture, it seems that they're saying he took broader, longer brush strokes as if he was doing an original piece versus trying to recreate something.
Right, and on the Henry one, they said he used free brush strokes as well.
Okay.
They think that both Henry and Mr. de Goud sat for their portraits.
Okay.
And that the Christian one, he was copying another painting. People copied paintings a lot back then because there was no photography. So if I was moving across the country and I wanted to have a picture of my children, I might hire somebody to copy a picture I already had, right, so that I could take it with me. Prince, we think, did a lot of copying of people's paintings as well as paintings of his own.
Wow. I really hope that we're able to locate more of the paintings. Some of the ones that were discussed in those letters you were talking about would be fabulous. It'd be so interesting.
Yeah.
Beckett, do you have another question?
Yes. We read that Prince Demah was enslaved, but then something else said that he was a free soldier.
Sure. So I think he was both. It's interesting. We don't know anything for certain about Prince before 1768, when he was probably about 27 years old. His mother was enslaved by the Barneses, and it may have been that he was sold away as an infant, which was a fairly common occurrence. When an enslaved woman gave birth, the baby would be sold to another family. But we don't know if that's what happened. But we do know that when Prince was an adult, Mr. Barnes purchased him, apparently because of his artistic talent, and he and Mrs. Barnes wanted to develop his artistic talent. So the Barneses were loyalists, and they, as I think I mentioned before, they had to flee Massachusetts in 1776 and go to England. But Prince stayed behind. And we don't know whether he was formally freed or he just became free as a practical matter because the Barneses weren't around anymore. We do know that he stopped calling himself Prince Demah Barnes and just started calling himself Prince Demah. And I think that's what we should respect, and that's why I think we should call him Prince Demah. It's what he wanted to be called. So he was living in Boston, and he became what was called a Prince Hall Mason. That may be something that you learn about when you're studying the 1700s, which was a small group of Black men in Boston who supported the revolution and petitioned for abolition of slavery in Massachusetts. And then we know that he enlisted in the militia in 1777, but then he died in March of 1778. He probably died of smallpox, which was, there were repeated epidemics of smallpox throughout the revolutionary period in the colonies. So it sounds like he lived an extraordinary life. He was enslaved. And he was free, and he was a Revolutionary War soldier. And there's an awful lot more I hope we can find out about him.
Oh my goodness, I hope so too. And I think to families who are watching this, that sometimes I found that when we wanted to diversify our children's lessons, particularly history lessons, we have to be willing to sit with the idea that we're not going to have all of the information or as much of the information as we do with some of our more traditional artists and composers and poets and people of that time period who were all white. So this is a little bit of what you give up, but I hope that in return, you create that, desire within your children to want to know more about other people, even if we can't get the whole story right now. So one thing that I found interesting, I ran across him first and I was really excited. But because there were only 3 pictures, we usually study a single artist for a term of about 11 or 12 weeks. I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to need another artist to go with him for this term so that we have enough art to study for our lessons. And so I came across another artist, Joshua Johnson, and I was able to find more about him, which was really cool. But when I first spoke with you, I mentioned him and you were like, oh yes, I know, something about him too. And then I was digging and I found a video, perhaps maybe you had spoken about him or someone from the Historical Society had spoken about him at your local library. And so if you're willing, I would love, I'll put some of his pictures up. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about Joshua Johnson as well.
Sure. Yeah, Joshua Johnson is much better known than Prince. Both of them were only sort of rediscovered long after they died. Prince just in the last few years, and Joshua Johnson maybe in the middle of the 20th century. So Joshua Johnson, he's a generation younger than Prince Demah. Prince was from the Revolutionary period, and his pictures are from that period, 1770s. And Johnson is mostly painted in the early Republican period, so around 1800 and a little bit after. And you can see that from the way they're dressed and the way they're posed in some of the pictures. It's a different period of time, except for the painting of the black man. They are remarkably uniform in their style. And it's a style that you sometimes you see in paintings that are sometimes called either naive or primitive portraits from the 18th and 19th centuries. They're very well made, the portraits, and Johnson has a lot of technical skill, but he seems to spend most of it on rendering the clothes, and maybe the background, sometimes what's going on outside the window in the picture. But there's a flatness, there's a stiffness to the people themselves and the way they're grouped in the paintings. We do know that he was self-taught. Like Prince, he was the child of an enslaved Black woman and a white man who later purchased him and set him free. Like Prince, his earliest works really come when he was in his 30s. And, that's kind of interesting because I think it shows that both of them had sort of a struggle, to get started and established as a painter. I think, these days, probably a painter is going to have paintings from their 20s or their teens or when they're in college or something. And both these men didn't really get started until their mid 30s. Unlike Prince, he didn't die. And so that's why we have a lot more paintings by Joshua Johnson. He probably had a 25-year career as a painter, and Prince had probably about a 3-4 year career as a painter. But I think if you'd ask most people, he was from Baltimore. Baltimore Museum of Art has a lot of his paintings. And I think that for many years, he was considered the earliest Black fine artist and in America. And I think that Prince, is on his way to toppling him off of from that pedestal, but he's still a very, very fine artist.
Yes, I think the book that I first read about Joshua Johnson, and it's an old book, and it did say that he was the oldest known. Of course, they hadn't discovered Prince Demah's work yet.
Well, and there are a couple that we don't have any paintings. There was an artist named Scipio Moorhead in Boston, also enslaved, and there's a lot of talk about his paintings, but there aren't any paintings, so.
We don't have anything to look at. Yeah.
Nothing to look at. And so, he sort of gets forgotten.
Okay, that's awesome. I was just going to say, what I was going to say, parents, if you're looking at the video, the pictures that I'm showing on the screen for both Prince Demah and Joshua Johnson are available to look at on my website. If you want to print out a set of prints for your children to actually hold in your house at your kitchen table. So they're on there. I'm not selling them. I don't have rights to them. They're just for academic use if you want to show your child. So let's see, Sasha, you had a really good question when we were talking earlier. Do you want to ask Mrs. Bagger? You have to unmute yourself.
So Joshua Johnson seems to be much more well-known than Prince Demah, but I think I like Demah's pictures more. Which do you prefer and why?
I like Prince's better as well. And I think it's because you can see the personalities of his subjects a little bit in the faces of all of his paintings. Well, the only ones we have. And Johnston's, as I say, while he's technically a very fine painter, the people seem to just kind of have a blank stare. you don't have any idea what they're thinking. I had mentioned this idea of what's called naive or primitive portrait painters in our early history. And a lot of the white painters were that way too. And it's a style, I don't care about it. I think you learn about Mr. and Mrs. Barnes from their paintings. You can see some pride in Mrs. Barnes. It's a little haughty looking. And I see a kindliness in the rendering of Mr. Barnes, which actually I find all the more interesting given the relationship between Prince and Henry Barnes. It seems like a little bit of a fond portrait. So it gives you more to think about when you look at Prince's pictures, in my view.
Awesome. And Nina, I really like the point that you brought up when we were comparing the two artists and talking about them compared to other artists we've studied in different time periods. Can you share that question?
Yes. We've studied a lot of Black artists, and most of their subjects are objects or Black people, but both of the artists mostly painted white people. Do you have any insights on their subject choices?
Well, I think first of all, Prince and Joshua Johnson are probably the oldest artists you've looked at, and earliest in time, I should say, right? Earliest artists, and you need to take that into account. There are not many paintings of Black people done by anybody, white or Black, in the 18th century in America, so you take that into account. Also, Prince and Joshua Johnson probably painted for their own enjoyment, but the de Goud portrait and all of the Johnson portraits are commissions. In other words, Johnson made a living, and Prince was trying to make a living, start out at it as portrait painters, to have people pay them to paint pictures of themselves and their families. And few Black people could afford that in the late 18th and early 19th century. There's the portrait of the Black man by Joshua Johnson, and I spent a little time yesterday trying to dig into that, Ms. Johnson, because to me, and again, I'd be interested to know what the kids think, it looks very different, extremely different from all the other paintings. And in fact, my first thought was, I don't think that's by Joshua Johnson. So that's why I started Googling, but everybody, I'm no expert, everybody seems to think it is, so I'm not going to say it isn't. A couple people think that's a self-portrait. And that would be kind of interesting, and that he might paint differently or use a different style when he's just painting at home, for himself, as opposed to a formal commission. There is one painting I found online, Ms. Johnson, that was not in your pack, but it was a portrait, a very stiff formal portrait like the other ones, of the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Baltimore. So that would have been an educated man, well-known, probably, either he or his congregation would have enough money, to pay for a portrait. So that would be the one exception. We know that Prince did his self-portrait a couple of times. It's in Mrs. Barnes' letters, but we don't know where they are.
Well, I'm gonna have to look that picture up. So I grew up in the AME church, so I know a lot about that church history, and that's that would be. Really,
I don't remember the pastor's name, but yeah, it began with a C. But they said, I don't know whether it's founder of the whole AME church or just the Baltimore one, but
the Baltimore one. Yeah, I will definitely look that up. Thank you for that. Girls, it looks like we had some attrition during the call. I don't know what happened to Beckett, but he made it through for a little while. Girls, do you guys have any other questions that you're wondering?
I have one. Okay. In the picture, that's up, more up, the dog is holding a bird in his mouth. But the bird doesn't look like it's dead. The bird looks like it's still soaring, but he just put a dog there.
Well, yeah, I think it's a good example of that sometimes there's a stiffness to Joshua Johnson's painting. Yeah, the bird's just like, I don't think the bird's flying, but 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 I don't think the bird's flying I don't think a dead bird would have its wings out like that. I completely agree.
So it reminds me some of his work, you know, that naive type of style of painting that you mentioned. I feel like we sometimes see this in a different way in folk art. I don't know, like if you have seen that or not. We went to I think it's the oldest folk art museum in Williamsburg, Virginia this summer. And there were pictures that looked like this, where the pictures of the people were kind of flat. Maybe the personality didn't come out as much, but of course those pictures had a lot more color and things. And I know it's different, but it kind of reminded me of that style.
I think it's very similar. And both of these guys are sometimes referred to as limners, Limners, as opposed to just painters. And in early America, limners were painters that would often go town to town to paint people. They would often bring with them canvases that had the bodies already painted, like pre-painted bodies. And then if you hired them, they put in the head. And so we have one of those paintings sort of at our museum. And the body is like the body of a young woman. And the head's this old lady. So the old lady obviously picked, the young lady body.
The body that she wanted.
Exactly. So, there is some of that. And I think that you also, if you look at these paintings, you'll see that some of the props are the same. That basket of whatever it is that kid's holding is in a couple of paintings. He'd sort of slot things in like that.
Interesting. And I think, Nina, did you have another question? No? Okay. Well, I think this was awesome. I just cannot let you know how excited we were. Oh, I'm sorry, Beckett, you're raising your hand. You popped back in, buddy. You have a question?
Yes. How do you know that his name was Prince?
Oh, well, because we have his baptism. Church records is one thing that you do have for Black and white people back then. And we have his baptism record and his death record, from the Trinity Church in Boston, which is where he was a member, and his Civil War record, Revolutionary War record. So we know his name was Prince. Was a very common Black name back then, to some extent still is, So yeah, no, we know that, and we're not sure about Demah. I mean, we know it was his last name, but we don't know if he actually was it the family's African name that they remembered from beforehand. Did he pick it because he just didn't want to be Barnes after he was free?
We don't know.
I think it's a wonderful question. It would be good to know the answer to.
That was good, bud. Well, thank you for all of, every time I get ready to, you pop
That's
in.
okay.
Okay, Sasha, bring us in with our last question, babe.
Well, with the Library of Congress, can tourists go inside and read the books and letters, or is it just because you're a historian?
No, that's the wonderful thing about the Library of Congress. I mean, you have to get a library card, but anybody can. And I went down to Washington and I showed up and I showed them my ID of some sort, and they gave me a library card. It is the People's Library.
How did you get a library card?
I went into their office and I had to fill out a form and show them my driver's license or something. I mean, I had to prove who I was, but I didn't have to prove that I was anybody special. It was just because I was a United States citizen, which blew my mind. I wasn't sure whether they'd let me in, but I thought that was wonderful.
Okay.
That's a good question.
Sounds like I have someone who might want to give that a
You got a
go.
field trip, yeah.
Yes, the field trip of all field trips. Well, thank you so much for this information. And you kind of answered this a little bit with Beckett's question about the baptism record, the death records, and the church records. I would love if you would answer one more question, which would be kind of getting your thoughts on the best way to research lesser known historical figures. And do you have tips for any of our families that will be watching? Families that would like to incorporate more diverse people from the past into their studies when we don't really know much?
Sure, I guess I've got two things. This is a perfect time to do this because historical organizations all across the country are responding to Black Lives Matter in the best way they as historical organizations can, which is by researching the history of persons of color, in their area. I know at the Hingham Historical Society, we are doing that, and we are finding out so much about the Black and Indigenous families in town. So I'd suggest the families get in touch with their local history organizations, historical societies, history museums, state, county archives, and ask them what they're doing on diversity and inclusion. And they may well have a good answer. And if they don't, then you'll be poking them to. It's also a great time for families to embark upon genealogical work. Even a few years ago, it was very difficult for Black families to make much progress in researching their family trees back beyond, a couple of generations. But that's something that is changing every day as well. Not only with things like ancestry.org, but also with, again, state archives, county archives. It's a wonderful, we have a lot of people come into our historical society who are looking to find out about their families, and there are a lot of records that are getting uncovered.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for that advice.
Sure.
And parents, if you want to read a little bit about our family history that we trace back to Major Richard Bibb, who was a Revolutionary War soldier who ended up freeing 100 of his enslaved people due to a religious conversion, and my family was part of that. You can search Richard Bibb on heritagemom.com and hear a little bit about that. So it's exciting. So thank you so much for the time you gave us today. We are really, really excited. I mean, you're going to be, there are going to be a lot of families watching this video, and you're going to be pouring into the education of so many children this year and beyond. So I just want to thank you, everybody. Ms. Bagger volunteered her time to do this with us today, and I just appreciate you and what you were willing to do for us.
Well, it was a lot of fun, and I can be reached at hinghamhistorical.org if anybody wants to talk about any of this.
Yay!
Yay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it, Ms. Johnson, and you kids were great and patient.
Thank you.
Okay.